Welcome to my series Into the World of Black Musicals, their history, and hopefully at the end of the series we can consider the question of what is a black musical. Today we'll be talking about the sensational musical called Jelly's Last Jam. So this week's musical is going to be a bit different for me to talk about because I've never actually seen Jelly's Last Jam and there are really no recordings of it online, yet I was able to read the book and listen to the album from which I'm able to piece a few things together. Jelly's Last Jam revolves around the life and death of Jelly Roll Morton. He's painted as an angry, misogynistic, colorist, egocentric, mixed-race Creole man who regards himself as the inventor of jazz. The plot showcases that as a young boy, his grandmother disowns him for rebelling and hanging out with darker-skinned and poor black people who play improvisational music. This trauma from his childhood seeps into his adult life as he goes on the road to play music. Eventually, this trauma causes him to betray his lover and best friend, along with unclaiming his blackness. Now, spoilers, but Morton does die and never apologizes to those he hurts in real life. In this play, it's only in the afterlife that he finally reclaims his blackness. This acceptance allows him in the final scene to take center stage with all of the great jazz legends like Armstrong, Ellington, and Count Basie. The musical premiered on Broadway at the Virginia Theater on April 26, 1992, and closed on September 5, 1993. It ran for a total of 569 impressive performances. However, it also first began a workshop run at the m-ARK Tap Room Forum in Los Angeles, California on March 1991. It was produced by Margot Lyon and Pamela Coslow, who have produced other controversial musicals like Hairspray and Caroline or Change. I should also note that Pamela Coslow and Gregory Hines were married. Keep this in mind as I consider these two shows deeply problematic, and I wouldn't consider Hairspray nor Caroline or Change black musicals, regardless of their catchy musical numbers, which I do enjoy. George C. Wolfe wrote the musical's book after August Wilson's and other versions were turned down. The lyricist was Susan Burkhead, along with the musical adapter Luther Henderson, and scenic design was Robert Wagner, the costume designer was Tony Leslie James, and the lighting designer Jules Fisher. Hope Clark also choreographed the show. In its Los Angeles run, Owa Batunde played Jelly Roll. Yet in its Broadway run, Gregory Hines played Jelly Roll and provided tap choreography with collaboration from Ted L. Levy. The rest of the large ensemble cast consisted of Savion Glover as Young Jelly, Keith David as Chimney Man, Mary Bond Davis as Miss Mammy, The Crowd, and Ancestor, Anna Duquesne Gran as the Grand Mimi and an Ancestor, Stanley Wayne Mathis as Jack the Bear, Tanya Pinkins as Anita, Ruben Santiago Hudson as Buddy Bolden, as well as Ken Ard, Adrian Bailey, Sherry D. Bone, Brenda Braxton, Ralph Deaton, and Mamie Duncan Gibbs. Once again, in this production team, we've got 4 black creatives and designers on the show. That includes George C. Wolfe, a black designer named Tony Leslie James, Gregory Hines, and Hope Clark. This is the most black creative scene since The Wiz, but we will explore if this alone makes something a black musical. I want to also give some background on these artists who made the show what it is. First, let's start with the director and writer, George C. Wolfe, who's a black American director known for directing many popular works like Angels in America and The Wild Party. Yet, it was Jelly's Last Jam that rose him to acclaim. He's also written the kind of controversial play, The Colored Museum, which was cited by many black activists as racist. Yet, George's work is meant to be deeply uncomfortable and confusing, but I think that comes with its own set of problems. I would keep this in mind as he's pretty divisive in the theater community and in the black community, but he's well cited by white male critics. Recently, he's directed Netflix's adaptation of August Wilson's Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Next, I want to talk about the costume designer, Tony Leslie James, who's a black American costume designer. She's done iconic costumes for various shows like Come From Away, The Scottsboro Boys, Finn's Rainbow, The Wild Party, Twilight Los Angeles, and Angels in America. Last but not least, I want to highlight Hope Clark and her choreography, her acting, and her directing. In her beginning days as a Washington, D.C. native, Clark performed as a principal dancer with the Katherine Dunham Company and the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. She's most notably known in 1995 for becoming the first African American, as well as the first African American woman, to direct and choreograph a major staging of the opera musical Porgy and Bess. She's also won a Tony for the staging. Yet, Porgy and Bess has its own complicated problems, but nonetheless, it's still incredible that she was able to direct and choreograph this. Don't worry also, I'll mention Gregory Hines later. Before we even get into the musical's impact, to better understand the context, we need to talk about the two people who this musical is loosely based on, and that would be Bobby Bolden and Jelly Roll Morton. So, who is Jelly Roll Morton, and how does he connect to Buddy Bolden? Buddy Charles Joseph Bolden was born on September 6, 1877 in New Orleans. Bolden was also known as King Bolden, and around town he was well known for his loud sound and improvisational skills. While he is cited to have created fusion music playing by ear, he's also created music such as ragtime, black sacred music, marching band music, and rural blues, making him the father of jazz. He also invented the Big Four, along with the popular dirty song called Funky Butt. Unfortunately, no known recordings exist of Bolden, his band, or his songs, except for the Funky Butt, which was recorded by Jelly Roll Morton. Sadly, Bolden was institutionalized due to mental health issues, and his music deteriorated with him. If you'd like to learn more about Buddy Bolden, you can watch the biopic film titled Bolden, or read the book titled In Search of Buddy Bolden by Donald M-ARK. He also is alluded to in the August Wilson play Seven Guitars. The musical itself doesn't really deeply discuss Bobby Bolden, nor does it give him a chance to speak. Instead, it pushes him and others aside for a character study on Jelly Roll. So, who is Jelly Roll? Jelly Roll, otherwise known as Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe, was born September 20th, 1890 in New Orleans as well. He was born into a Creole community, and at the age of 14 began playing in brothels. He also claimed to be the inventor of jazz, which was criticized and disputed by many. He worked in various bars, in minstrel shows, and in vaudeville acts, but was actually able to record many of his songs. Unfortunately, he also leads a tragic end as well. In 1938, Morton was stabbed, suffering serious wounds. The closest hospital refused to treat him as it was whites only, so he was taken to a black hospital further away from that, and he was properly entreated, causing him worsening asthma and respiratory problems that led to his death in 1941. He also dies basically penniless and forgotten. Jelly Last Jam includes some sources of his life, but takes many damaging liberations. For instance, in my research, I found very little evidence that he was as loudly racist or as colorist as this musical claims. In fact, this musical makes many disturbing liberations with Jelly's life. To make matters more complicated, Morton even credited Bolden as the most powerful trumpet player I've ever heard, or was ever known, even though he also copyrighted the song, which again makes it complicated, but the musical kind of disregards that. My question is, why paint someone who refuted his black identity or someone who is not treated as a black man when that isn't the case? Why paint Jelly Roll as someone who dies utterly alone when he actually married as well as dies because of institutional racism? To get insight into this, a Chicago Tribune article states, however much of a risk Wolf may be running in reinforcing ethnic stereotypes with Jelly's Last Jam, he says he is attempting to create a musical that is less toe-tapping retrospective of a black American music. Wolf goes on to state, Jelly was a very gifted musician, in a time that this country when racism was very pronounced. His whole approach seemed to be, if I decide I'm not black, then maybe I won't be treated like a black. The show is about how we all use our vanity to cover up our fear, to make ourselves invulnerable. But if you create something extraordinary, and Jelly Roll did, you come from a place and a context, says Wolf, and you must honor that in some way. You must honor the source. But again, this is not Jelly's entire stance. It's a narrow depiction and assumption that Wolf unfairly puts on him while silencing the other black voices that made up his life. Each character, especially Anita in this musical, is hollow and is used as an empty silhouette to reinforce Jelly as a bad character to eventually be redeemed. This stance, when looking at the choices made, are troubling to say the least. This is all pretty complicated, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's backtrack to see who was tasked with portraying the life of Jelly Roll in a musical, let alone who came up with the idea. According to a Playboy article, the original producer, Tony winner Margot Lyon, opted the material based on a series of 1938 interviews in the Library of Congress between Alan Lomax and Jelly Roll Jordan. Lyon says, I love New Orleans. I plan to do a light, entertaining musical that explored the origins of jazz, which I think is the only true American art form. Well, maybe rap is another one too. Lion approached a number of writers over the next 4 years, and none were able to tackle the immensity of the recorded interviews. I even hired August Wilson, who had only seen one musical in his life, Zorba. August wrote me a beautiful poetic play. It was about a stranger who came to town, and every 5 pages or so there would be a cluster of Jelly's music. That wasn't what Lion had in mind, though, and the two parted on artistic differences. In 1982, Lion then met Pam Koslow-Hines, who came on as co-producer. At the time, Pam's husband, Gregory Hines, was looking for a vehicle for himself to direct. Greg ultimately decided that he wanted to play the role, so Lion and Koslow continued their search for a writer and a director. Then, in 1985, the award-winning composer and arranger and orchestrator, Luther Henderson, joined the team. They later found George C. Wolfe from his work on the musical Spunk, but it's interesting that August Wilson was turned down. I want to reiterate that there is nothing wrong with white creatives having a hand in musicals based on people of color, but I also can't deny that I find Lion's comments of loving New Orleans and rap being the original American art form a bit strange, as they look at both New Orleans and Jelly and black culture through a white gaze. Once again, we've got a white producer who looks at them through this white gaze, regardless of her intent, to make something positive of black culture. So, I guess whiteness and its gaze really can't be removed from this musical either. However, in the end, George did create many of the original characters, and he also wrote that characters could break the fourth wall and address the audience. A quote from the same Playbill article I mentioned a bit ago states, "I viewed black musicals before Jelly as a form of cultural strip mining. The exterior remained, but all the culture that signified where the people had come from and their connection to the earth was absent. Therefore, George and all the ensemble members did collaborate in what the musical came to be." However, when it came to the show's production and backstage history, that was also quite complicated. Hope Clark states from an interview, "We did the first Jelly in California, which was entirely different than the one we did on Broadway. I don't know why we had all those changes. I wasn't the first choreographer. That was Otis Salad. They were having difficulty with Otis in getting his contract together. I was in his house and he was cooking soup. He does do good soup. And he said, 'Hope, you better get ready.' And I said, 'Get ready for what?' He said, 'Because I am not going to do this show.' I don't think he really wanted to work with George. George can be difficult. But with George, you really got to turn it out. You have to be really on point on your toes with the choreography because, in fact, he thinks he is a choreographer." So we took it to California, and I thought it was quite wonderful. George's ideas, he has this great ability to see things. He's really can see it. It was difficult, though. The show itself, you have so many characters. And when we brought it to New York, it was a whole new Jelly's Last Jam. And that became difficult, working with Gregory Hines. But we got through it. And it got up. It was really quite wonderful. So, from that quote, it alludes that maybe the production history and the collaboration on this musical wasn't exactly as easy as it seems, or as effortless as it should be. If you'd like to check out more about what the production history was like, you can check out this documentary called Jammin' with Jelly. I'll post a link below just on YouTube, but there's also a video posted on the American Theater Wing website. What really sells the show is the dancing through its new casting of Gregory Hines. This is one of the few things that actually shows the complexity of black art and is intrinsically tied to the core of the musical. Tap dance, as a dancing form of essential black storytelling, is often what the character of Jelly uses as a way to get out his anger and his frustration. In a way, you could kind of call Jelly's Last Jam the original Billy Elliot of black life and expression. As with this musical, each performer and performance will be different because tap relies on improvisational skills just like jazz, which I think is pretty interesting. This improvisational black art being incorporated into the script is due to the work of the choreographers and of artists like Gregory Hines, who is regarded as one of the most acclaimed American tap dancers. Let me give you a little bit of biography on Gregory himself. Hines started classical tap training at the age of 3, but he cites most of his tap knowledge from watching other great dancers. He also starred in over 40 films like The Cotton Club, Waiting to Exhale, Tap, Bojangles, and The Preacher's Wife. Hines, in this musical, uses his incredible singing and dancing skills to make Jelly's emotions central to his body, or rather, central to his feet. While Hines did pass away at age 57, his tap, film, and singing legacy will always be remembered. Yet, just because the show has good tap dancing, does that constitute making it a black musical? I don't think it does, especially since there were other shows that include just as brilliant tap dancing. Hines even premiered in other Broadway shows like Eubie and Sophisticated Ladies, which was in 1981, and they've been more lauded by black communities. I must also mention that tap dancing being presented on stage without proper facilitation has its problems due to its tight association with minstrelsy and stereotypes. Hines even mentioned this hesitation with tap in an article by dance critic Brian Sieber. "I wanted to be real," he recalled. And he, Gregory Hines, didn't feel real while performing. "My family wanted me to smile. I never wanted to smile." For a young African-American dancer, smiling was connected with shame, with a sense of sterility, stemming from tap's roots in slavery and black-based minstrelsy. But when he returned to tap, he discovered how to smile without losing his cool. Jelly's Last Jam knows this, and even has a particular scene where Jelly is surrounded by large, white-faced. While I get the sentiment of showcasing these racial stereotypes to be shocking and ugly as George C. Wolfe often does, I feel that this show doesn't go deep into why that's a problem, or how minstrelsy and being an Uncle Tom continues to live on in our histories. In fact, it seems to lean into the eeriness of it all without explaining anything in context. I have an issue with this. I think anytime we put tap or any other racial stereotypes on stage, we must understand and recognize its negative as well as positive associations. Tap is not automatically negative, but it's about how one stages it, and it's about who's watching, whereas in this case, who's watching is still largely a majority white audience. My other issue with musicals like this is that too often in theater, we negate and dismiss problematic scripts for beautiful visual pictures, or we dismiss it in order to be shocked by racial stereotypes. Sure, the tap dancing and performances are absolutely spectacular in Jelly's Last Jam, but does this musical showcase or dissect how blackness and whiteness hold power? Or does it just contain shock and spectacle for mainly white patrons? Good art, in my opinion, is not just about how shocking something looks, but it's also about the message and the positive and or negative impacts that one can display. You will have to determine on your own how far you're willing to go for shock value. But for me, I think that one can never truly, as Audre Lorde said, destroy the master's house with the master's tools. This means that putting racial stereotypes like this for mainly white audiences on stage with no real purpose will continue to perpetuate the same things. Again, this is a very controversial subject, and I'm not saying that I speak for all black people, but I do think that this show really doesn't do all that it claims. The show did win many awards. Tanya Pinkins and Gregory Hines won Tonys and Drama Desk Awards for their performances, along with the show winning a Tony for Best Lighting Design and a Drama Desk for Best Books, Orchestrations, and Lyrics. Yet, if you watch the rest of the series, you know that for me, accolades don't make a musical more eligible to become black, nor does having a black cast. And I'm still puzzled by the many awards it won, considering that the book has its issues. You know, one of the many ways I think about what constitutes a black musical outside of the white gaze is its reception and impact. So let's talk about that. The writer and critic John Lohr wrote the introduction in the book of Jelly's Last Jam. He praises the musical for its depictions of black life and for the grotesque and ugliness that shows in American landscapes. Yet, I think I may push back on what Lohr says, as a lot of his writing, I think, too much praises the musical without proper analysis from black audiences' perspectives, but I'll get to that in a second. I certainly don't speak for all black people, nor do I have the typical black experience, but I didn't know about this musical until further research, nor in the many conversations that I have with other black folks that they even seem to care about this show. No one seems to have memorized the music to this musical either, nor do they embrace it as prolific for them. It doesn't premiere in regional theaters that often or in schools, whereas in my many other videos on black musicals, the songs were notable. You know, for instance, in The Wiz, Home was played at many different musical theaters in the country. But these songs in Jelly's Last Jam often fall flat without gaining the same attention. While I could counter-argue that having non-catchy songs is a resistance to the white commodification and commercialism, something still feels off about this musical, who at the same time buys into the very thing that it works to resist. This is not to discredit it, but I don't believe that this musical was targeted to Black audiences, even with its significant Black creatives. Maybe it's because Black people just don't want to see racial stereotypes put on stage, or maybe because there's some significant hurt in seeing appear on a largely jazz-based musical. I mean, it's still stagnant also in its Blackness, which is targeted and sold to white audiences. I didn't think that there was anything new added to the show. I think that this makes a very compelling case for Jelly's Last Jam not being a Black musical, which is pretty hard for me considering that I didn't think that I was going to come in stating that something is or isn't a Black musical. I thought it was going to be a bit more complex than that. And even though this musical is very complex, I don't want to negate that, I think there's something eerie and off that wasn't displayed in any of the musicals I mentioned before in this series. With all of this considered, I'm going to be totally honest. I largely entered this musical without any previous knowledge, and I can say with certainty that I felt underwhelmed with Jelly's Last Jam. And I do struggle with removing my lack of passion and my uncomfortability with this musical and in discussing it. So I apologize in advance if I seem a bit more sarcastic or if Jelly's Last Jam means something really important to you and I negate that fact. I'm all here for us dissecting the grotesque and looking for the ugliness in Americanisms and in colorisms in America, and I'm all for putting that on stage. But does this musical really do that? I would argue that it does not. This musical makes me nervous because I really do have an opposing opinion on this show than maybe others do. And I really didn't like it, nor the stereotypes it perpetuates, nor the boring ways in which it treats Black women and showcases the well-known fact that racism is in fact ugly, but then wraps everything up in a neat bow at the end. Yet, this isn't a series about whether or not I like a musical. It's about dissecting and discussing what is a Black musical. So, let me take my perspective out of this as much as I can and ask, is Jelly's Last Jam a Black musical? One of the ways I break down if something is a Black musical is through its reception and looking at who the musical is for. Yet, when I ask myself this question, I become even more conflicted because largely I do not know who this musical is for or who its target audience is. I think it fails to target Black audiences. Again, we know we can never truly strip our own perspective nor our biases, so let me just be frank with this. This musical tells me, a Black woman, exactly what I've known, that Black people, specifically Black men, be colorist. Yet, it fails to tell me anything more, nor does it work to give any of the characters depth besides characters of what George C. Wolfe thinks they are. In the end, a fictional depiction of Jelly in Limbo gets to still be lauded as a famous Black musician, even though he treats everyone terribly and never regards his Blackness. This musical showcases that light-skinned Black men get to be immortalized and redeemed even though they don't deserve it. So, again, who is this musical for? Maybe this is a show about the need for Black, lighter-skinned men to internally create the show for themselves, to prove their Blackness, to prove that they too belong in the greater scheme of things. Now, of course, lighter-skinned Black men matter, but the show works too hard, in my opinion, to tell us and not to show us how Jelly lives his life as opposed to those with darker complexions, nor does it really dive into why Jelly has been set up his whole life to view those with darker skin as beneath him. Well, they do try their best to make his light-skinned Creole grandmother the villain, which seems a bit misogynistic to me. I mean, blaming his whole ideology on her is kind of vapid. Why not show us that larger society makes Black people colorist? Why not show us how this happens? This musical feels the need to not explain anything, which in some cases I do get, because if you're targeting it to Black audiences, you wouldn't have to explain, but it doesn't ultimately make any stances on the way in which Black men treat Black women. And nor does it show how they use women as props, nor does it ask why we set up a caste system regarding skin color. It also doesn't answer the question of what it means to profit off of Blackness with no recognition of those who cannot shed their skin color in the same way. It allows Jelly Roll to have no accountability for those he hurts or rejects. On the other hand, according to a Chicago Tribune article, the quest for identity or the discovery of authentic ethnicity is a resounding issue in African American culture, and for a Black person to deny that identity or to attempt to squash that ethnicity is a major sin. This is certainly valid, and the quest is valid, especially in regards to the Black experiences. We all as Black people are constantly negotiating and dissecting and crushing our own identities. I mean, is this not what I'm doing by exploring the Black musical with this series? Like, I'm exploring what identity is and what Black people are and the many ways in which we identify ourselves. So I do understand the sentiment that Wolf is trying to get with Jelly Roll. Yet, I also ask, is it okay for Wolf to say that in death, Jelly Roll is forgiven for profiting off of his own whiteness when in his life he uses white supremacy that allowed him to have power and only hurt those that he loves? Something feels strange about this problematic man getting a perfect redemption arc and a forgiveness story in the end when he actively rejects his Blackness to make money. I mean, Jelly Roll is able to do things in this musical in a way in which Louis Armstrong could never do. Not to mention that this is all fictional. It's an idea made up in the mind of George himself, which feels a bit unfair to Jelly Morton, especially when it falls flat in giving women and darker-skinned characters a voice too. Again, like I mentioned, in my research, I never really found adequate proof that Jelly Roll was as colorist as Wolf makes him out to be. And he does this all while using a rampant trail of slurs with no point beyond shock factor for white audiences. I mean, there are many issues with the show, and I think the deeply disturbing stereotypes, slurs, and redemption arcs need to be carefully considered when regarding if this is in fact a Black musical. I bring this all up because I think it's important to dissect, regardless of if you love Jelly's Last Jam or not. I guess my question is, can something be a Black musical if its main characters not even regard themselves as Black until their death? Can something be a Black musical if it refuses to really dig deep into how we often commodify Blackness, but also reject it in the same breath in order to become successful? Can something be a Black musical if it basically does the exact same type of commodification with its plot, ironically missing the entire point? I'm not sure. While many would argue that this complication and frustration I feel is the point, I don't personally think that it follows through in its statements. I get that people like shocking theater that they can kind of dissect and root through, and that seems to be George C. Wolfe's whole point. But for me, this musical is in fact selling Blackness to white audiences without carefully consideration of the discussion of immortalizing a fictional Jelly Roll jam. This is in no way shade to George C. Wolfe. I feel like I have to state that. I certainly think that he's a talented and groundbreaking Black director. But even he is not above any of my criticisms. That is to say, I cannot separate George nor the collaboration that many Black folks in this show put in the musical, and I don't want to separate that. I think it's important to realize and understand, just like in Dreamgirls, that Black folks did play a big role in creating this. But just because Black folks made significant contributions in this musical doesn't mean that the musical did anything successful, nor did it negate its point. At the end of the day, I both have to remember that this show was originally still created by white women who do not have the best track record on Broadway, and I can also remember that at the same time, I can acknowledge that George did change the face of musical theater by bringing Black drama and social commentary to the forefront of the musical theater genre. So, yes, while the musical has some very talented Black people on its crew, it's still largely created or comes from the minds of white people. So, what does this mean? Just like how Jelly Roll in the musical exists in a limbo between alive and dead, or even immortalized and forgotten, I think this musical exists in a limbo between Blackness and whiteness, making it neither a white musical nor a Black musical. Its inability to become one thing or another has transcended it into nothingness and everything at the same time, and we all have to make our own individual conclusions on how we feel about it. In conclusion, Jelly's Last Jam shows us why we have to critically examine not only who is on stage, but also who's off stage. We also have to ask what statement art can make. Is it better to shock, or appall, or delight audiences? And is it possible to put stereotypes on stage without it also carrying backfiring connotations? This episode was very confusing for me, and I could barely make a definitive statement, yet I think it's good to struggle with and mull over how we represent identities on stage. While I can't say that Jelly's Last Jam is a musical that I like, that doesn't mean that other Black folks can't find something impactful in it. I actually think this week's conversation of representation, stereotypes, and alternative history will tie in perfectly into the last two musicals. So, join me next week as I discuss The Color Purple, and thank you so much for watching. Bye.